Moment from the war that Russia is waging on Ukraine. Make no mistake, these images will go down in history as some of the most defining images of the Ukrainian invasion. A shocking explosion was caught on the streets of Ukraine's Cherkasy. Russian artillery hit a civilian on a bicycle. Ukraine has also claimed that Russia is now targeting civilians. After an attack on Russia's port city Odessa, Russian military strength was on display on the streets of the port city. Military tanks were seen roaming around the city of Odessa. The aftermath of the attacks on Ukraine's capital city Kyiv paints a devastating picture. After heavy attacks early morning in the city, residential buildings are now in shambles. Ukraine, though, is fighting back. It has blown up a bridge near the capital city of Kyiv in order to prevent it from being used by the Russian army. Meanwhile, the Russian military is rolling its tanks at the iconic Chernobyl nuclear power plant that lies between Ukraine and the Belarus border and the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. Ukraine's president's office claims that it could be one of the most serious threats in Europe. Amid the attacks across Ukraine, locals fear for their lives. Panic-stricken Ukrainians have taken shelter in bunkers. In the capital city of Kyiv, visuals of wreckage of an aircraft has emerged. The visuals show an aircraft that crashed into a residential building in Kyiv. Anti-war protests have broken out in 51 Russian cities. Russian police have detained at least 1,400 people who turned up against their own government for waging a war. Children have become the biggest casualty of this war. Parents in Mariupol, Ukraine, struggle to find the words to explain to their children why they were hearing explosions. After a full-scale invasion, refugees have started fleeing Ukraine and taking shelter in neighboring countries, Slovakia and Hungary. Hungary has extended temporary legal protection to Ukrainians. Tatiana Kukhreva joins us, Deputy Head of Sputnik News, joining us from Moscow in Russia. The latest information coming in, Tatiana, is that President Putin now willing for negotiation with the Ukrainian delegation in Belarus. What details can you give us about why the Russian president has accepted the Ukrainian offer after the Foreign Office first said that unless the Ukrainian army gave up arms, there's no question of dialogue? Do you hear me, ma'am? Ola Vorozbit joins us, Deputy Editor-in-Chief from Kyiv in Ukraine. Ola, welcome. Can you give us a sense of the mood in the Ukrainian government? President Zelensky making an offer of dialogue after being invaded by the Russian army. Is that to suggest that President Zelensky realizes that without the help of NATO and the United States, it's very difficult to hold against the Russian army?
Hello, thank you for the invitation. Our Ukraine wants negotiations, but at the same time, Ukrainian army is ready and it defends Ukraine. So we have a strong army and it defends and it repels lots of attacks from Russia. So Russia just what Russia does, it violates the international law with shelling onto the apartment blocks all over Ukraine. And of course, President Zelensky said that we need support from NATO and from our Western partners. But at the same time, he said that he's ready to negotiate. But we don't know what, he's ready to negotiate. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that Ukraine is ready to refuse what we are to refuse our goals, because as you know, our goal to gain the NATO membership and the EU membership is written into our constitution. So these negotiations doesn't mean that we will refuse doing that, but this means that we want to have to bring back peace, and this would be not only with military. And not only with military actions, so with defending our state from the war, from the invasion from Russia, but also with the negotiations.
Okay, Nandan Unnikrishnan joins us. Nandan is a lifelong India-Russia expert and far and away one of the top experts on all things to do with Moscow in our country. So Nandan, welcome. It's great to have you with us. And I want your reading of the situation that's at play currently between Russia and Ukraine. First, everyone watching at this time would like your best sense of how the military attacks started by the Russian army at the behest of Putin have gone. The Ukrainians are putting out a lot of information about how some planes have been brought down, some helicopters have been brought down, some people have been taken hostage. But on balance, would you say that Russia at this moment seems to be enjoying overwhelming force superiority over the Ukrainian army?
Thank you, Rahul, for inviting me. The first thing is that, you must recall that Ukraine's military infrastructure, which exists today, was built by the Soviets. And the detailed plans of whatever the Soviets built lies in Moscow. And Russian satellites would have been watching Ukraine ever since the Soviet Union broke up, so they would know about whatever upgradation or changes that were taking place at the old infrastructure. So the Russians have a fairly good idea about what Ukrainian military capabilities are, what new weaponry they have acquired. So I don't think they've gone in blind, in that sense, and they are fully aware of what they are likely to face. They also understand that the Ukrainian people are unlikely to just welcome them with open arms, that the Ukrainian people are likely to resist, and there may be very fierce resistance in pockets. But unfortunately, I have to state that the overwhelming superiority of conventional forces that Russia enjoys over Ukraine, on the military front at least, does not bode well for Ukraine.
How long do you see the Ukrainian army hold out, in your view and on the basis of everything that you're picking up from your network in Russia and in Ukraine? How long will it be before the Russian army takes control of Kyiv, if at all taking physical control is part of their military game plan?
Well, right now, I will tell you one thing is that nobody knows what the GHQ in Moscow has in mind. The second thing is that I don't think a full-fledged ground assault has yet begun, or it's only the contours of it that we are seeing. So it is very difficult to make a judgment about how deep and how far they are willing to go. But one thing is extremely clear as far as I am concerned, is that the Russians are not going to settle for anything short of displacing this government. They want this government removed, and whether they are able to put a puppet regime in place or not is a different question. But this government will have to go. So that is why Kyiv is one of the targets at this point of time. After that, how deep and how far, we will get to know maybe in the next couple of days.
I remember the time that we spent together in Moscow on reporting assignments. Always value your insights on everything to do with Russia. I want to go across to Tatiana Kukreva, Deputy Head of News at Sputnik News. And your sense, ma'am, sitting in Moscow, of what's going on in President Putin's mind. Does he actually hope to physically hold the capital city of Kyiv? Because the people in Ukraine, many of them are very hostile to the Russian army and the Russian president, and therefore would fight back. It could turn into a guerrilla warfare very quickly, and lots of body bags would start coming back to Moscow. Is that part of his plan, or is he just really looking to shock, awe and force into submission the government of President Zelensky?
I guess that it's $1 million question, isn't it? Unfortunately, I don't believe that anybody apart from President Putin actually can tell you what's on his mind, because that is his mind after all. When it comes to the hostility that you mentioned, that's a very interesting point that you bring up. Just as much as some people are hostile to what's going on, there are literally reports, and there are things that put forward by the Russian Ministry of Defense. We have footages of people, of Ukrainian armed forces actually crossing over to the Russian side, surrendering to Russian military forces, and those are confirmed images of actual members of the Ukrainian armed force. And that just brings us to the root of the whole problem to begin with. Ukraine being a very difficult state in terms of, before the coup d'etat in Kyiv, you call a pocket regime, you're talking about, any sort of ambition of putting forward a pocket regime. However, the government that was in place in Kyiv before the coup d'etat, it was not a pocket regime. It was just elected by the Russian-speaking half of the population of that nation. It's a mixed nation, and there is the Ukrainian-speaking population in the west and the Russian-speaking population in the east. The people who, before the conflict began, even before that, considered Russian to be their native language, and considered Russian, the Russian-speaking.
Can I bring a Ukrainian perspective on that? You're making an important point, and I want to get Ola to respond to it. Tatiana is saying that, like in the western part of Ukraine, there are people who are upset with the Russian invasion and will fight no matter what. In the eastern part, there are many who are actually rejoicing and welcoming the ingress of the Russian army, and they don't necessarily tend to think of this as a bad thing, and therefore Ukraine itself is split on the issue of whether they'd like to be more closely affiliated with Russia or not.
Well, no, that's just the number of Russian propaganda points, because main spots for Russian invasion, for missiles that were hit, were, for example, in Kharkiv, and people were giving there the huge resistance, also kicking out the Russian tanks outside of Kharkiv, which were trying to get there, and which, by the way, killed civilians while trying to get into the city. And people all over Ukraine, also in the eastern part and also in the southern part, which Russia says are like pro-Russian, they are now anti-Russian, just because, like, if you hear, for example, Ukrainian soldiers, they speak very often in Russian, and they are fighting those people who violated our sovereignty and territorial integrity, those who are coming from Russia. And that's the point here. What Tatiana was talking about was just the point of, like, Russian propagandists' main points, because what we had in 2014 is seen as coup d'etat only in Russia. All the other parts of the world see this as a peaceful revolution, which was tried to crack down by the security forces of the former president, which is now in Russia, which just flew to Russia because he was afraid of his people. That's the point. And after that, we had free elections. Ukraine has free elections all over its 30 years of independence. So we did not have any coup d'etat. And Ukrainians here, if they were pro pro-Russian, then whom you see like saying hello or being happy with the Russian times here. Russian-speaking people are getting to the territorial defense units. They are just kicking out all those invaders who are trying to get into their houses. And that's the point. I was yesterday, when everything started, I was near Kyiv. I was going through the whole Ukraine because I live in Western Ukraine. I met lots of people here on my way. Half of them were Russian speakers, half of them were Ukrainian speakers, and all of them were against the invasion. And Russians themselves are against the invasion their president started. So sorry, but these messages are just illogical. This is the number of propaganda points which are easily contradicted. And well, you will see that they are wrong. Just you can see this here, being on the ground. I guess just maybe Tatiana just haven't been to Ukraine.
Okay, I want to show our viewers, with Geeta's help, a broad sense of what's happening in Kyiv. Remember, we already know that in Chernobyl, you've now got the Russian army that's taken charge. Also in the eastern part of Ukraine, which you can see here on the map. Can we just zoom into the map so that Geeta and I can talk you through this? The parts marked out here in red are Russian-backed separatist controlled areas, which is where the Russian army came in from initially, and that's the part where Vladimir Putin first announced that he was going to get these statelets recognition. It's here in the north, in Chernobyl, on the Belarus-Ukraine border, that the Russian army has gone in. It's still radioactive, even though there is a massive exclusion zone where it's said that it's safe, but this is what Ukraine says poses a threat, Geeta, to all of Europe as well. And this is the western area towards Lviv, which is where Indian students are now being evacuated from to countries like Poland, Romania and others. Geeta.
Absolutely, Rahul. Kharkiv is where the majority of Indian students are concentrated. So it's a long drive to Lviv, which is where now the US Embassy had moved to, but they're moving out, and they moved out of Ukraine as well. So it's a long drive, and most of them are finding it very difficult to find transport, which is why that's the Herculean task for the Indian administration to get the students here. If you look at the map, on this side you have all NATO member states, and these NATO member states are not coming to Ukraine's rescue. They're providing air support. They could very well provide drone support, but they're not entering Ukraine. Look at how Ukraine is surrounded on the eastern on the eastern front of Ukraine. We have Belarus, absolutely pro-Russia, almost a puppet state. Then we have Russia, we have Donetsk and Luhansk, the separatist breakaway regions, which are now declared independent states, and then Crimea, which was annexed in 2014. The kind of troop build-up mobilization that we are seeing in Belarus, in Donetsk, Luhansk, and in Crimea is certainly going to overwhelm Ukrainian forces.
Joining us now, Volodymyr Ariv, a Ukrainian member of parliament. Mr. Ariv, welcome. Thank you for joining us at a very tough time for your country and your people. Give our viewers a sense of President Zelensky's offer for talks with President Putin, and President Putin saying he'll be willing to send a delegation to Belarus to talk to the Ukrainian side. What could these two countries possibly bring to the table, which could lead potentially to end of military hostilities?
First of all, I don't believe in the goodwill of Putin to have real talks to withdraw his troops from Ukrainian territory. And in such cases, usually both sides going to choose the neutral state as a place for negotiations. But Belarus, with Minsk as a capital, is not a neutral state, as well as the huge attack on the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, organized from the territory of Belarus. So Russia and Belarus, they are two countries, two states that made a union. So we need, first of all, to talk about another place. And the second, the agenda. Do this agenda be acceptable for Ukraine, as well as we clearly see the intention of Russian troops and Russian leader to seize power in Ukraine. So this is clear intention. But for the moment, Ukrainian army effectively defends Ukraine and effectively defend Kyiv. Russia has a record number of losses for one day. It's more than 1,000 soldiers they ever had after the Second World War. So we have enough active army, and we have something to put on the table very seriously.
Tatiana, has the Russian army given any estimates of the death toll? We're seeing these claims from the Ukrainian member of parliament, and before that from his government, that more than 1,000 Russian soldiers have died in hostility so far.
I actually think there are very laughable claims of such losses. But again, you know, I've heard from the speakers that spoke before, you know, when somebody comes from Western Ukraine and they say, well, look, there's no contradiction between the East and the West. Well, yes, of course you would see it that way in Western Ukraine, just as much as Euromaidan was not accepted in the East, and there were protests against it all over Eastern Ukraine, from Mariupol to Kharkiv. Not Kyiv, but Kharkiv, Russian-speaking city. It has always been Russian-speaking city. Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Lugansk, all of those cities, even Odessa, where, you know, the border point, the island border point, completely surrendered to Russian soldiers, to the Russian military forces just, you know, a couple of hours ago. Those are laughable claims, and the only reason that they're being voiced so loudly is the fact that, you know, that our Ukrainian colleagues are just shouting them from all rooftops. No, of course the Russian
Ola is shaking her head very vigorously, disagreeing with what Tatiana is saying. Ola, yes.
Yeah, just because it's very, very interesting to hear the position about different cities of Ukraine or different regions of Ukraine from a person who sits in Moscow. But there is the other thing I want to mention also to Ukrainian MP. There was an information also from the Ministry of Defense of UK, so not only Ukraine, about the yesterday. So their estimates about the yesterday's Russian losses were like around 400 people. So these numbers that Ukrainian MP names now, they might be correct, because today we had there were lots of battles, and Ukrainian army repelled a lot. So we have not only Ukrainian estimates, but we have the estimates from the Western country, from the UK. They announced about that today. And concerning the point that our Russian colleague mentioned, that I already told you that, for example, 2 weeks ago we had, before Russia started this full-scale invasion of Ukraine and shelling of the apartment blocks in Kharkiv and in other Ukrainian cities, hitting with missiles Kyiv, which we haven't seen from the Second World War, such a huge number of rockets coming to our capital. So before that, 2 weeks ago in Kharkiv, there was a huge rally with Ukrainian flags. Already 2 days ago, we had a huge rally in Mariupol, in Kramatorsk, with Ukrainian flags. And people were signing there in Russian, but they were signing, Putin, go away. Don't come to our houses. This is the main point.
And Tatiana, there have in fact been protests in places like St. Petersburg as well. We saw very strong anti-Russian army, anti-Putin protests, which the Russian government and police had to come down very hard on. So it's not as if all of Russia is jubilant. In fact, from my course at the Harvard Business School, I have several colleagues, cohort mates from Russia, many of whom are deeply upset, even if they say so only in private and not voice their opinion on social media, but saying so in private WhatsApp conversation, that they're very upset with what their president is doing. So it's not as if all of Russia is, rejoicing with President Putin's aggression.
Well,
Tatiana.
you know as well as I do that you can take a good picture with, 20 people and show it as thousands. But according to official numbers, we saw some 600 people arrested in Moscow, 600 for a city with 20 million, almost 20 million population. That's actually not a serious protest, and you can agree with me, I hope, in that. It was the same in St. Petersburg. I would hardly call it mass protest. And the only reason that the police were there is that it was not coordinated with the authorities, that protest. Again, you know as well as I do what those protests, that the protests that are not coordinated with the authorities are rarely allowed, and it doesn't have anything to do with the subject of that protest.
Okay.
In the meantime, we have our lovely Ukrainian colleagues saying that everybody's against Russian presence in eastern Ukraine. And shelling of, residential areas. Ukrainian armed forces put missile launchers on central squares and in residential areas, in Kyiv and in Kharkiv. Those pictures are out. Those pictures have been authenticated by the people who live in those cities. And that's actually how, that's how terrorists operate outside of Russia.
Okay, joining us at this time is Vidi Soni, former ambassador to Ukraine. We have Lieutenant General Syed Atta Hasnain, really sharp military mind. We'll try and understand from them the diplomatic and military aspects of what's at play, especially from an Indian lens. But we'll slip into a break before that. A lot more coming up on the other side. Stay with us. We're back in 2.
Самолет Ю